They told me, "You'll be helping science, Mom, just trust me." But when I woke up, I was strapped to a hospital bed, a stranger's face hovering over me, and no explanation except a sterile whisper that I was part of a clinical trial. That was the moment I realized the son I loved had betrayed me in the cruelest way imaginable. I'm 81 now, and though I live quietly in my small apartment, every corner holds the echo of that day when trust fractured, and I understood how thin the line is between love and control. My name is Evelyn, and I used to be a nurse. Not just any nurse, but one who cared for people with dignity, who believed in choice, in respect, in being seen as a person. That belief is what made the betrayal cut so deeply. I remember sitting in my living room the night before the hospital visit, sipping chamomile tea, the familiar warmth a sharp contrast to the cold uncertainty that was to come. My son, Thomas, had always been a man of science, proud of his work in biotechnology, and though we never talked much about the details, I trusted him implicitly. When he told me I was enrolled in a clinical trial to help with my memory, to prevent decline, I believed him. It wasn't until the hospital lights flickered harshly above me and the straps bit into my wrists that I understood I had been signed up without my consent, without even a whisper of warning. He had used my past, my nursing license, my supposed competency to convince the doctors and ethics board that I was a willing participant. The paperwork had my name, but not my voice. And as I lay there, eyes dry but heartbreaking, I knew this was not care. It was possession disguised as help. The days that followed were a slow descent into confusion. The medication they gave me, part of the experimental treatment, was a cocktail of unknown chemicals with side effects that rippled through my body and mind like waves crashing on jagged rocks. I felt dizzy, nauseous, and worst of all, increasingly alone. Thomas visited often, or so I thought. His visits were brief, clinical, as if he were checking a box on a checklist rather than comforting a mother. He spoke to me in a tone that was both condescending and distant, the voice of a man who believes he knows better, who assumes obedience rather than asks for consent. "You'll thank me later," he said once, a phrase that twisted like a knife. My phone was mysteriously quiet. Calls from old friends unanswered, messages left unseen. I was being isolated, carefully controlled, and slowly erased. The world outside my hospital room shrank until all that existed was the sterile smell of antiseptic and the cold gleam of fluorescent light. But inside me, something stirred. I was no longer just a patient or a subject. I was Evelyn, the woman who had spent decades caring for others, who knew the value of autonomy and dignity. I started to keep a journal hidden under my pillow, recording every symptom, every moment of clarity and confusion. I tested myself each morning, counting backwards from 100, naming presidents, recalling old recipes. I refused some doses, slipping pills into a small pouch I kept secret. It was a silent rebellion, a small flame of resistance flickering in the darkness. And then one morning, I decided to mirror his control in a way he wouldn't expect. I swapped his allergy pills with sugar pills, harmless but effective. Watching him struggle with sneezing fits and watery eyes was a quiet satisfaction. He was the one feeling out of control for once, fumbling with tissues, rushing to meetings and apologizing for missed calls. It wasn't revenge. It was a lesson in respect and consent. When he confronted me, angry and bewildered, I was calm. I had spent years teaching others about health and safety, and now I was using that knowledge to protect myself. I showed him the journal, the medical notes I had gathered, and a letter from the lawyer I had quietly contacted. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was prepared. I mailed the report to the trial's ethics board, detailing the unauthorized use of my body and trust, the physical and emotional harm I had endured. I didn't ask for forgiveness or understanding. I only asked to be seen and respected. That moment, standing in my kitchen with a cup of cold tea in my hand, was the moment I reclaimed my life. The son who had tried to control me became the man who had to answer for his choices. And I became Evelyn again, not just a mother, not just a patient, but a woman who would not be silenced or erased. Now, years later, I volunteer at a local clinic, folding linens, talking with patients, and sharing quiet smiles. My hands are steady, my mind clear, and my heart guarded but open. The tea is warm again and the kitchen filled with the scent of old books and fresh hope. I want other women like me to hear this. Sometimes the greatest act of love you can offer yourself is to say no, to hold your ground, and to make your voice heard when others try to speak for you. It is never too late to reclaim your story, your body, your mind, and your dignity. The moment everything changed wasn't sudden, like a slap to the face or a shouted accusation. It was slow, a creeping realization that I was no longer in control of my own life, that the son I had raised with so much love and hope had quietly, without a word of warning, taken the reins and driven me into a place I did not want to go. It began the day he told me about the clinical trial. Thomas sat across from me at the kitchen table, his hands folded neatly over a sheaf of papers, his face the picture of calm determination, the kind of expression a man wears when he is convinced he is doing the right thing but doesn't care to explain why. "Mom," he said, his voice low and reassuring, "this trial is an incredible opportunity. It could slow the progression of your memory issues, maybe even improve them. You'll be helping science, and it could help so many others." I nodded, trusting him as I always had, my heart willing to believe in the hope he offered. But I didn't understand then that this was not a conversation or a choice. It was a plan already set in motion, with me as the unwitting subject. The next morning, I was taken to the hospital for what I thought would be a routine checkup, the kind I had undergone countless times in my years as a nurse and patient alike. Instead, the sterile white walls, the clinical clatter of machines, and the sharp scent of antiseptic told a different story. I remember the cold metal of the bed beneath me, the straps tightening around my wrists before I even had the chance to ask what was happening. The nurse who came to check my vitals smiled politely, but didn't answer my questions. "You're enrolled in the trial, Mrs. Carter," she said, almost as if reading from a script. "This will help doctors learn more about Alzheimer's and dementia." But I hadn't signed any papers. I hadn't agreed to anything. When I called Thomas, his voice was clipped, almost rehearsed. "Mom, it's all legal. You signed the consent forms years ago when you renewed your medical license. They said you were competent to consent." It was a lie. I had never signed anything. I was never asked. He had used my past as a nurse, my supposed mental competence, as a shield to justify his actions to the doctors and the ethics committee. It was a cruel betrayal, and it cut deeper than any physical wound. As the days passed, the trial's effects became painfully clear. The medication I was given caused waves of dizziness that sent me staggering to the bathroom, nausea that sapped my appetite, and an unsettling fog that clouded my thoughts in moments I had once been sharp enough to navigate through the darkest nights. Thomas would visit, but his visits felt like inspections, not the tender care of a son for his mother. He talked over me, explained things I didn't understand in a voice too loud and too slow, as if I were a child rather than an adult who had raised him and cared for hundreds of patients over decades. "It's for your own good," he said repeatedly, the words echoing hollow in the quiet room. "You don't want to forget me, do you?" But what he didn't understand was that the loss of trust, the erasure of choice, was worse than any lapse in memory. I was isolated, not by walls or locked doors, but by silence and omission. My phone calls went unanswered. Messages from old friends disappeared into the void. I caught glimpses of family gatherings on social media, photos of birthdays and holidays where I was the ghost in the background, unseen and unacknowledged. My son had begun to write a narrative about me, a narrative of decline, of frailty, of a woman slipping away before I had even lost a step. It was as if he was trying to preempt my protests, to make my resistance invisible before it even began. And I felt that creeping, suffocating feeling that I had known before in other guises, the slow erasure of a person, the quiet removal of a life. One afternoon when Thomas was away, I overheard a conversation he had on the phone. His voice was low but urgent. The trial needs a perfect profile. She fits the criteria: age, medical history, even the nursing background. It makes the paperwork easier. No one will question her ability to consent. I felt my heart tighten, a cold wave of anger and despair washing over me. He wasn't just controlling my body, he was controlling my story, rewriting it without my knowledge or consent. I realized then that the clinical trial was not about my health or my wishes. It was about data, about research, about his career. And I was the pawn. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. I was alone one morning, feeling particularly dizzy from the new medication dose, when I found an old notebook tucked away in a drawer. It was a journal I had kept during my nursing training, filled with notes about patient care, observations, and the importance of consent. Flipping through the pages, I remembered who I was, what I stood for. I began to document everything: the times I felt foggy, the pills I was given, the side effects that no one seemed to care about. I hid the journal beneath my mattress, a secret testament to my fight. Slowly, I began to refuse some doses, hiding the pills instead of swallowing them. It was a small act of rebellion, but it felt like reclaiming my body. Then came the moment I decided to act in a way that would make my son understand what it felt like to be powerless. I carefully swapped his allergy pills, a harmless daily regimen he took religiously, with placebos. It was a simple act, but watching him struggle with sneezing fits, watery eyes, and irritated skin brought me a quiet satisfaction I hadn't felt in months. When he confronted me, the anger in his voice was sharp, but I met it with calm resolve. I showed him my journal, the notes I had taken, and the letter from the lawyer I had secretly consulted. I wasn't confused or vindictive. I was clear and prepared. That confrontation was the turning point. The son who had seen me as a subject now faced a mother who refused to be silenced. Finally, I took my evidence to the ethics board overseeing the trial. I sent the report with my medical logs, photos of bruises left from injections, and a clear statement that I had been enrolled without consent. There was no accusation, only truth. I didn't expect immediate justice or apologies, but I wanted to be seen, to be heard. And in doing so, I reclaimed my dignity, my agency, and my life. The trial that was supposed to control me became the catalyst for my freedom. The son who had signed me up without consent was forced to reckon with the woman he had underestimated. And I became Evelyn again, whole, fierce, and unbreakable. After the initial shock of discovering that I had been enrolled in a clinical trial without my knowledge or consent, the days and weeks that followed settled into a slow and insidious erosion of my autonomy, a gradual tightening of invisible chains that I could neither see nor immediately break. It was not a sudden rupture, but a creeping, quiet control that began to seep into every corner of my existence, blurring the boundaries between care and captivity. At first, the changes were subtle enough that I questioned my own perceptions, the way a ship's captain might doubt the compass when the sea is shrouded in mist. The medication regimen that had been thrust upon me brought with it a host of symptoms that were easily dismissed as normal side effects: dizziness, fatigue, a tremor in my hands. But as they multiplied and compounded, the real toll became undeniable. My mind, once sharp and steady from years of nursing and managing household affairs, grew foggy at unpredictable intervals, making even the simplest tasks feel like crossing a turbulent river with uneven stones beneath my feet. I would reach for a teacup and forget why I had lifted it, my thoughts scattering like autumn leaves caught in a sudden gust of wind. Thomas was the architect of this slow unraveling. He monitored my doses with the precision of a technician and spoke to me less like a son and more like a supervisor overseeing an experiment. "It's important you keep taking your medication exactly as prescribed," he would say, his eyes fixed on his phone, where he tracked the schedules and notes from the trial coordinators. When I hesitated or questioned the effects I was experiencing, he would offer reassurances that felt hollow, delivered in the clipped tone of someone who had rehearsed every line to preempt dissent. "These symptoms are temporary," he said once, brushing off my complaints about nausea and disorientation. "It's all part of the process. You're helping science, Mom. Remember that." But the more I tried to cling to that notion of helping, the more I felt like a ghost drifting through my own life, observed and measured, but never truly present. Isolation crept in like a slow poison. My phone, once a lifeline to friends and former colleagues, became a source of frustration and heartbreak. Calls went unanswered or were abruptly cut off. Messages from those who cared slipped into voicemail with no return contact. Thomas, whether consciously or not, controlled the flow of communication, ensuring that the outside world saw only the version of me he allowed. At family gatherings, I became a figure of polite sympathy, a woman who was not quite herself, whose memory was failing, as if I had been reduced to a character in a play written by others. This narrative was carefully crafted to shield Thomas from questions and to preempt any resistance I might muster. I watched photos of holidays and birthdays on social media, where I appeared as a distant smile, barely acknowledged, a shadow fading into the background of celebrations that once felt warm and inclusive. The loneliness was a tangible thing, pressing down on my chest like a heavy quilt in the dead of winter. Yet amid this growing invisibility, I refused to disappear. Something deep within me, forged through years of caring for others and standing firm in the face of life's trials, stirred into life once more. I began to notice the small inconsistencies, the times when Thomas's calls came from different numbers, the moments when I caught a glimpse of him hurriedly erasing messages on my phone. I realized that the clinical trial was not just a medical intervention, but a means of control, a way to silence and subdue me under the guise of love and concern. My medical history, once a source of pride, had been weaponized against me. My past nursing license twisted into a justification for signing me up without my knowledge. It was as if my identity had been stripped down to a clinical data point, a subject to be studied rather than a mother to be loved. In the quiet moments alone, I began to piece together a plan, subtle and deliberate. I knew that outright rebellion would bring only more surveillance and restrictions, so I chose the path of quiet resistance. I started keeping a hidden journal, a small worn notebook that I tucked beneath the folds of my mattress, recording every symptom, every detail of my daily routine, every interaction with Thomas and the medical staff. It was a secret act of defiance, a reclaiming of my narrative from the hands that sought to rewrite it. I began to refuse doses without telling anyone, slipping pills into a small pouch hidden in my clothes, testing how my body and mind would respond without the medication. Some days were harder than others, but each moment of clarity was a victory, a step toward regaining control over my own life. Thomas noticed the changes and responded with a mixture of frustration and fear. His visits grew more frequent but shorter, his tone sharper, the veneer of calm slipping to reveal the desperation beneath. He began to question my competence openly, speaking to other family members and doctors in hushed tones about my progression and resistance, as if I were a patient in a ward rather than a woman fighting to remain whole. I heard whispers of meetings where my fate was discussed without my presence, decisions made behind closed doors about my care and autonomy. It was a slow, suffocating siege on my independence, a reminder that love, when mixed with control, can become a cage. Yet I was not defeated. I found strength in small acts, walking slowly around the neighborhood, feeling the sun on my face, talking to neighbors who still saw me as a person and not a patient. I reconnected with an old friend, a retired nurse who recognized the signs of medication misuse and encouraged me to seek legal advice. With her support, I reached out to a lawyer who specialized in elder rights and medical ethics, quietly building a case that would protect me from further exploitation. This network of allies became a lifeline, a reminder that I was not alone in this struggle. The first escalation was not marked by dramatic confrontations or loud arguments, but by the steady erosion of my autonomy and the quiet assertion of my will to resist. It was a battle fought in the shadows of hospital rooms and family dinners, in the spaces between whispered phone calls and erased messages. The medication was not just a chemical burden, but a symbol of the control wielded over me. And every pill I refused, every journal entry I wrote, was a reclaiming of my identity and my right to choose. As the weeks passed, I grew more certain of my path. I would not be a passive subject in this trial or in my own life. I would fight with every breath and every word to be seen, to be heard, and to be respected. The first escalation was painful and exhausting, but it was the beginning of my return, a slow, deliberate reclaiming of self that would lead me to confront not only my son, but the entire system that allowed this betrayal to happen. I was no longer just Evelyn the patient. I was Evelyn the woman who would not be silenced. There came a moment, quietly yet irrevocably, when the scales began to tip, and I found within myself a strength I hadn't realized I still possessed. A spark that refused to be extinguished despite the layers of control and betrayal that had been imposed upon me. This shift was not heralded by a grand declaration or a sudden outburst, but by a steady, deliberate decision to reclaim my body and my mind, piece by piece, day by day. After weeks of fog and confusion, of doses taken under duress and moments of despair, I began to awaken to the reality that I was not simply a passive participant in this clinical trial or in my own life, but an agent of change who could navigate her own course even within the narrowest of confines. It started with the journal I had hidden beneath my mattress, the small book where I documented every symptom, every shadow of dizziness, every lapse of memory. Writing became my anchor, a tether to the self I had been and the self I still was determined to be. The act of putting pen to paper was itself an assertion of agency, a refusal to disappear silently into the clinical margins assigned to me. I began to experiment cautiously, testing the boundaries of the trial's hold over me by refusing some of the medication doses without informing Thomas or the medical staff. Each skipped pill was a quiet rebellion, an act of self-preservation, and a statement that I would not surrender my mind to their control without resistance. The side effects, while unpleasant, began to recede slightly during these days, and with that clarity came a renewed sense of purpose. I practiced simple cognitive exercises, recalling old nursing techniques and medical knowledge I had long stored in the back of my mind. I repeated tasks that once seemed effortless, but had grown difficult under the influence of the drugs. Folding laundry, making a cup of tea, recalling the names of plants from my garden. With each small victory, the fog lifted a little more, revealing a woman who was far from defeated. But it was not only my mind that I sought to reclaim. I needed to teach Thomas a lesson in respect and consent, to mirror back the violation I had endured so that he might understand the weight of his betrayal. With painstaking care, I swapped his allergy pills for sugar pills, harmless, indistinguishable to the eye, but enough to send his body into confusion. Watching him struggle through sneezing fits, watery eyes, and the frustration of unexplained symptoms gave me a quiet satisfaction that was neither cruel nor petty, but necessary. It was a way of reclaiming power in a situation where I had been stripped bare. When he confronted me, anger and disbelief flashing in his eyes, I met his fury with calm clarity. I showed him my journal, my medical notes, the letter from the lawyer who now represented me. I was no longer the confused mother he assumed I was. I was a woman who had learned to fight back, who had gathered evidence, allies, and courage. This shift was as much emotional as it was practical. I began to see myself not as a victim of circumstances, but as a woman reclaiming her dignity and autonomy in the face of overwhelming odds. I reconnected with old friends who believed in me and who reminded me of the life I had led before this dark chapter began. Their voices, their stories, their laughter breathed new life into my days. I found solace in the small routines I could still control. Brewing a perfect cup of tea, tending to the plants on my windowsill, listening to the radio programs I loved. These acts were not mere distractions, but acts of resistance. Daily affirmations that I was still here, still Evelyn, still whole. The medical world that had sought to contain me was beginning to feel less like a prison and more like a battleground where I could stake my claim. I engaged in conversations with the trial coordinators, asking questions they had not expected, challenging protocols, demanding transparency. My son, once the gatekeeper of my life, was losing his grip as I asserted my rights and knowledge. The lawyers I had engaged worked quietly but effectively, helping me navigate the complex legal landscape and ensuring that my voice was heard beyond the sterile walls of the hospital. It was during this time that I also began to repair the fractured relationship with my own sense of self. The confusion, the fog, the isolation had all chipped away at my confidence. But this new phase was about rebuilding, about piecing together the woman I had been with, the woman I was becoming. I wore my old nursing pin again, a symbol of my past strength and care. I began to speak out to others in similar situations, sharing my story quietly, encouraging them to hold on to their own voices. I found empowerment not only in resisting, but in connecting, in knowing that I was not alone. The midpoint was not a dramatic turning point marked by fireworks or confrontation, but a steady, quiet reclamation of agency. It was the moment when I stopped being a passive participant in my own story and became the author. I chose to act, to think, to fight. The clinical trial, the betrayal of my son, the medication's fog no longer defined me. Instead, they became the backdrop against which I stood tall, clear-eyed, and resolute. This shift was the beginning of my true journey back to freedom, a path that would lead me away from control and towards self-determination, one deliberate step at a time. The second escalation arrived quietly at first, a whisper beneath the storm, but it quickly grew into a relentless pressure that tested every ounce of my newfound resolve. After reclaiming a degree of control over my body and mind, after swapping my son's allergy pills with placebos and standing firm in the face of his anger, I thought perhaps the battle was nearing a close. That reason might prevail, and the ties of family might soften the hard edges of betrayal. But I was wrong. What followed was a confrontation that forced me to look not only at the man who had taken advantage of me, but also at the painful, tangled web of love, disappointment, and expectations that had bound us for so long. This phase was not marked by dramatic shouting matches or public scenes, but by cold, calculated attempts to reassert control, to rewrite the story once again, and to push me back into the quiet, compliant figure I had been before. It began with a visit, unexpected and unwelcome. One afternoon, as I was tending to my small kitchen garden, the familiar sound of the doorbell echoed through my apartment. I opened the door to find Thomas standing there, his face pale and drawn, his eyes avoiding mine. He was accompanied by a man I didn't recognize at first, wearing a sharp suit and holding a leather briefcase that seemed too heavy for the words it carried. This man introduced himself as a legal representative, sent by Thomas and others in the family. Their message was clear. They were concerned about my well-being, about the decisions I was making, and they wanted to intervene before things got worse. The lawyer spoke in clinical tones, citing medical reports and legal precedents, painting a picture of a woman who was vulnerable and confused, unable to care for herself, and in need of protection. I listened silently, my heart pounding not with fear but with a fierce clarity. I knew this was not about care, but control, a last desperate attempt to pull me back into the role they had crafted for me. The role of the helpless mother, the declining patient, the obedient subject. Thomas spoke next, his voice strained, pleading almost as he asked me to reconsider my decisions, to come home, to accept the treatment and the support they were offering. But I was no longer the woman who had trusted blindly. I was Evelyn, the nurse, the survivor, the woman who had fought to reclaim her autonomy. I told them calmly that I was safe, that I was in control, and that I had legal counsel. I explained that the trial they had signed me up for without consent had caused harm, that I was taking steps to protect myself, and that I did not wish to return to a life dictated by their decisions. The lawyer's gaze flicked to the papers in his hands, then back to me. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "we understand your frustrations, but the law allows family members to petition for guardianship in cases where there is concern about a person's capacity to make decisions. We are prepared to initiate this process if necessary." The words hung heavy in the air, a threat cloaked in bureaucratic language. I understood what this meant. A legal battle, the potential loss of my rights, the erasure of the progress I had made. But I was not intimidated. I met his gaze steadily and said, "I am of sound mind, and I demand to be treated with the respect and dignity every human being deserves. Any attempt to remove my autonomy will be met with legal resistance." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. Or maybe it was anger. It was hard to tell. He said, "Mom, we're only trying to help. You don't know what's best for you anymore." I shook my head, the weight of years of disappointment and betrayal settling like a stone in my chest. "I have never needed saving from myself," I said quietly, "but I have been betrayed by those I trusted to love me." Their visit left a residue of tension and sorrow in the apartment, a reminder that love and control can be dangerously intertwined, and that sometimes the people closest to us can become the greatest obstacles to freedom. But the escalation did not stop there. Within days, I received a letter from the Clinical Trials Ethics Board informing me that an investigation had been launched based on my report and that my participation in the trial was being reviewed. The letter was a small victory, a sign that my voice had pierced the walls of silence and indifference. Yet alongside this came a barrage of messages from family members, some filled with genuine concern, others laced with guilt or thinly veiled accusations. They painted me as difficult, stubborn, and ungrateful, unwilling to accept help or acknowledge my limitations. It was a narrative I had heard before, one that sought to diminish my agency and recast my resistance as irrational or selfish. Amidst this turmoil, I found unexpected solace in the visits of an old friend, Margaret, a retired nurse who had known me for decades. She came without judgment, offering companionship and quiet support. Margaret helped me navigate the medical jargon, encouraged me to keep detailed records, and reminded me of the strength I carried within. Her presence was a balm to my weary spirit, a reminder that I was not alone in this fight. Together, we explored avenues for advocacy and legal protection, building a fortress of support that would shield me from further attempts to control my life. The second escalation culminated in a confrontation that was both deeply personal and profoundly symbolic. Thomas came to see me one evening, his face a mixture of desperation and resignation. He asked to speak privately, away from the lawyer and the cold formality of legal threats. In that quiet moment, I saw not just the man who had betrayed me, but the son who had been caught in the tangled web of fear and expectation. We spoke honestly, painfully about love and control, about fear and freedom. I told him that I loved him, but that love did not grant permission to take away my rights. I explained that the greatest act of love would be to respect my choices, even when they were difficult or uncomfortable. He listened, and for a moment the distance between us seemed to shrink. But the struggle was far from over. The legal battles loomed ahead, and the scars of betrayal ran deep. Yet in that moment of fragile understanding, I felt the power of truth and the possibility of healing. The second escalation was a crucible, a test of my strength and resolve, but also a reminder that even in the darkest conflicts, there can be moments of grace and connection. As I reflect on that time now, I see it as the turning point where the fight for my autonomy became a battle not only against external forces, but also within the heart of my family. It was a time of pain and reckoning, but also of profound growth and awakening. I emerged from it not broken, but stronger, more determined to live on my own terms and to reclaim the dignity that had been denied to me. The second escalation was the storm before the calm, the painful passage through shadows toward a future of hope and freedom. The moment of climax in this long and painful journey was not marked by fanfare or dramatic confrontation, but by a quiet, deliberate act of reclaiming my power and dignity, a final step that severed the last threads of control my son and the clinical trial had sought to impose upon me. It came after weeks of gathering evidence, of enduring whispered threats and veiled attempts to undermine my sanity, and after the crushing realization that the family I had nurtured no longer saw me as a woman deserving of respect, but as a problem to be managed, a burden to be contained. I had reached a point where silence was no longer an option and where passive resistance had to give way to decisive action. With the steady hands of someone who had spent a lifetime caring for others and fighting for the vulnerable, I prepared my case and sent it forward, not as a plea, but as a declaration of my autonomy and truth. I began by compiling every piece of evidence I had meticulously gathered during my time in the trial and beyond. My detailed journal entries describing the symptoms and side effects I endured, photographs of the bruises left by injections administered without proper consent, medical records that contradicted the official narrative, and transcripts of conversations where my concerns were dismissed or minimized. Alongside this was the legal documentation prepared by my attorney, a woman fierce in her commitment to elder rights, who had become my steadfast ally in this battle for justice. The report was carefully written, clear and uncompromising, naming the individuals responsible for enrolling me without consent and detailing the emotional and physical harm caused by their actions. It was sent directly to the ethics board overseeing the clinical trial, an institution tasked with protecting the rights and well-being of participants, but which had failed to see me as anything other than a data point. The day I mailed that report was one of quiet triumph. I sat at my kitchen table, the soft light of the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the worn wood, a cup of tea cooling untouched beside me. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the release of years of tension and suppressed anger. I had done what I could to stand up for myself in a system that often overlooks the voices of the elderly, especially women. I did not expect an immediate response, nor did I seek one. The act itself was a boundary, a line drawn in the sand, an unyielding refusal to be silenced or erased any longer. It was the moment I reclaimed my story, and in doing so, reclaimed myself. In the weeks that followed, the consequences rippled through my life like a rising tide. The clinical trial was put under review, my participation suspended pending investigation. My son, who had wielded control with the certainty of a man convinced of his righteousness, found himself facing the possibility of professional censure and legal repercussions. Family dynamics shifted uneasily. Conversations once easy now fraught with tension and unspoken accusations. I received messages from distant relatives expressing shock and support, and from others, cold warnings to think carefully about the path I had chosen. But I stood firm, supported by the knowledge that I had acted not out of spite, but out of necessity and love for myself. This act of sending the report was more than just a legal or medical intervention. It was a profound reclaiming of my identity as a woman, a mother, and a human being deserving of respect. It was a refusal to be diminished, a stand against the creeping invisibility that so often befalls elderly women in families and in society. The power I felt in that moment was not loud or violent, but steady and deep, like the roots of a tree that withstand the fiercest storms. I had taken control of my narrative, transformed from a passive subject into an active agent, and that transformation changed everything. In the quiet aftermath, I found myself drawn back to the life I had once known, not the one dictated by others, but the one I chose for myself. I resumed volunteering at the local clinic, a place that smelled of antiseptic and hope, where I could offer care and companionship to others without surrendering my own agency. Each folded linen, each kind word exchanged with patients and staff was a reaffirmation of my strength and resilience. The tea in my kitchen was warm again, the silence filled with the comforting hum of a life reclaimed. I spoke softly into the camera, my eyes steady and clear, knowing that my story might resonate with other women who had been silenced or dismissed. "They count on us being confused," I said, "on loving them too much to make it public. But sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for them is to make it official." This was not a message of bitterness, but of empowerment, a call to all who feel trapped by betrayal and control to find their voice, to stand firm, and to reclaim their dignity. The climax of my story was not the destruction of relationships or the collapse of a family, but the rebuilding of a self, the quiet but unyielding assertion that I am more than a patient, more than a subject, more than a shadow in someone else's narrative. It was the moment I became Evelyn again, whole, fierce, and unbreakable. In the quiet that followed the storm of confrontation and reclamation, I found myself standing at a threshold I hadn't dared imagine for years, a place of peace, of acceptance, and of gentle rebuilding. The battles with my son, the clinical trial, the legal challenges, all of it had carved deep scars, but it had also forged a strength within me that no one could take away. I returned to my days with a newfound calm, embracing the rhythms and small joys that had once seemed out of reach, volunteering at the clinic where the scent of antiseptic mingled with the soft murmur of caring voices became my sanctuary. There, I was no longer a subject or a case, but a woman whose hands and heart still held value, whose presence mattered in quiet, meaningful ways. My tea was warm again, the steam curling softly in the morning light, a small but potent symbol of normalcy and control. The routines I rebuilt were my own, tending to my modest garden, walking slowly through familiar neighborhoods, reconnecting with old friends whose support was as steady as the earth beneath my feet. I allowed myself to feel the fullness of being present, no longer haunted by the shadows of betrayal, but illuminated by the steady glow of self-possession. The phone, once a source of anxiety and control, now rested quietly beside me, its silence a deliberate choice rather than a forced one. I was learning to listen, to myself, to the soft pulse of life around me. The relationship with my son remained fractured, a tender and painful reality. Yet amid the distance and the unspoken grief, there was a fragile thread of connection, mostly carried by letters and occasional calls from my grandson, whose voice was a balm and a reminder that not all ties are severed by hardship. He did not judge or demand. He simply reached out with a quiet hope, a gesture that spoke of new beginnings. I treasured these moments, knowing that healing is a slow, unfolding process, sometimes more about presence than words. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with hues of amber and rose, I found myself writing a letter, not to my family, but to myself. The words flowed like a river, carrying the weight of years and the lightness of newfound freedom. "Dear me," I wrote, "you waited so long for someone to save you. You forgot you were always the one holding the key. You didn't lose them. They let go. And you finally let go back." The letter was a mirror and a map, a testament to the journey from silence to voice, from invisibility to presence. I tucked it carefully inside my dresser drawer, a quiet talisman for days when the path might seem uncertain. Life did not suddenly become perfect. There were still aches and moments of loneliness, the inevitable reminders of the past and the passage of time. But these were no longer chains. They were threads woven into the tapestry of a life reclaimed. I found joy in small things: the laughter shared with friends over afternoon tea, the gentle knock of a neighbor bringing a freshly baked pie, the soft purring of a cat curling in my lap. These moments were not grand or heroic, but they were mine, and that made all the difference. I want to speak to any woman who finds herself silenced, controlled, or diminished by those she loves or by a world that forgets her worth. You are not alone. The journey back to yourself is not easy, but it is possible. It begins with a single step, a refusal to be invisible, a decision to reclaim your story, your body, your mind. It is a path walked with courage, patience, and the fierce love of a woman who knows that she deserves to be heard. You do not need permission to be who you are. You are not a burden, a problem, or a shadow. You are a woman with a story that matters. So, if this story finds you at the right moment, do not wait for a sign or a savior. Be your own sign. Make your own noise in the silence. Step away from the places and people who hold you back, and when you do, come back and tell me. I will be here, listening, waiting, believing in your strength. And if this story moves you, share it. Let someone know that it is never too late to choose yourself, to live fully and freely, and to reclaim the dignity that is your birthright. The days that followed my decisive act were not a clean break from the past, but rather a slow unraveling of tension, like a tightly wound rope that releases one fiber at a time, each loosening accompanied by a faint sting. I had sent the report to the ethics board, had put my signature to the truth, and had done so without flinching. Yet the silence that came in response was both a relief and a torment. I would sit in the mornings with my tea, the steam rising and curling into the cool air, wondering what was happening behind the closed doors of their offices, whether they were reading my words with the gravity they deserved or filing them away with polite indifference. I did not regret my choice, but I could not deny the quiet hum of anticipation and anxiety that wove itself through my days. Thomas did not come by in those first days. His absence was a strange kind of presence, a heavy shadow that followed me from room to room. I imagined him pacing his apartment, weighing his next move, or perhaps sitting in some sterile office, explaining himself to people who now held his career and reputation in their hands. There was a part of me that wished for a letter or a call, not to offer apology, though I longed for that more than I cared to admit, but simply to acknowledge the reality between us, the sharp truth that could no longer be ignored or smoothed over. But there was nothing. Margaret, steadfast as ever, visited regularly. She brought fresh bread from a bakery we both loved and sat with me for hours, her presence a gentle reminder that loyalty still existed in the world. We spoke of ordinary things, gardening, books, the change of seasons. But every now and then, our conversations would circle back to the trial, to the long months of control and silence. "You've done what many can't," she told me one afternoon, her voice carrying that nurse's steadiness I remembered from my working years. "You faced them, and you told the truth. That's not just for you, Evelyn. It's for everyone they might have done this to." Her words sat with me long after she left, like a small ember that warmed me from the inside. Nights were more difficult. Sleep did not come easily. Memories had a way of seeping into the darkness, replaying moments I would have preferred to leave behind. I would see myself again in that hospital bed, the straps biting into my wrists, the fluorescent lights bleaching all color from the world, the sound of a nurse's voice speaking to me like a child. But then the images would shift to Thomas as a boy, his small hand in mine, his questions tumbling out in a rush, his trust in me unshaken. That was the cruelest part of all, knowing that the man who had orchestrated my silence was the same boy I had once taught to always ask, never to assume. Yet even in those restless hours, there was a growing sense of ground beneath my feet, of something solid and unshakable returning to me. I began to plan small changes in my life. Nothing drastic, just quiet shifts that reminded me that my time, my choices, my days were mine to shape. I rearranged the furniture in my living room so that the chair I favored faced the window where the afternoon light streamed in. I started making lists again, not of symptoms or appointments, but of things I wanted to do. Visit the botanical garden in spring, write to an old friend in another state, try a new soup recipe. One morning, I walked to the park a few blocks away. The air was crisp, the kind that wakes you fully with every breath. Children were playing on the swings, their laughter ringing like chimes, and I found a bench where I could watch without drawing attention. There was a kind of therapy in simply observing life unfolding without my interference, without my being the one on display. A woman about my age passed by and smiled, and for reasons I can't explain, that small exchange felt monumental, as if the world was quietly acknowledging my return. I began to write again, not just in my journal, but in letters I never intended to send. I wrote to Thomas, to the younger version of myself, to women I imagined might be facing the same quiet erasure I had endured. In those letters, I allowed every thought to flow: anger, love, disappointment, hope. I wrote not for answers, but for release, and in the act of writing, I found something close to forgiveness, though not the kind that absolves or forgets. This forgiveness was for me, a loosening of the grip that bitterness can have on the heart. I realized slowly that this time between the act and its consequences was its own kind of freedom. It was the space where I could decide how to live going forward, not as someone defined by the harm done to her, but as someone who had faced it and remained standing. There would still be difficult days, still be moments when the past pressed in close, but there was also a widening horizon ahead, one that belonged wholly to me. And in that quiet stretch of days, I began to believe, truly believe, that I had stepped out of the role they had written for me and into the one I was always meant to play, my own.